Hello guys, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the cheapest iMac Apple sold back in 2009. And by cheapest I mean one, if you went on Apple's website, this was the cheapest one you could buy, costing only 1,999 Australian dollars. There was a cheaper model released for the education market, but you couldn't just walk into an Apple store and buy it. So I think it's time we take a look. This iMac owes me basically nothing as I got it in a large lot of computers for a total of $50. Thankfully the machine does turn on. However, it looks like the hard disk has either been wiped or is dead. Booting into an install USB reveals that the Mac doesn't detect a hard disk whatsoever. While it's not overly dirty, we'll be sure to give it a good cleaning once we've reassembled it. The original sticker covering the Apple logo was still stuck on. That's one very pristine reflection. These iMacs regularly sell for less than $50 on eBay. 2009 was the last year you could buy a 20-inch iMac from a retail Apple store. I think it's time we tried opening this machine up. First off, a single Phillips head screw holds the RAM cover in place. It's not immediately obvious how you're supposed to get inside this Mac. After doing some research, it turns out that the glass display cover is held in place magnetically. A pair of suction cups made it pretty easy to remove. Sadly, the iMac appears to be missing nearly all of its internal screws. Next, I removed the outer casing, being sure not to rip out the microphone cable. Before we remove the display panel, I have to unplug a few connectors from the logic board. Lifting from the left side, I removed the 20-inch panel. I really didn't expect this, but it appears as if most, if not all of the screws are in this little bag. To remove the logic board, I began unscrewing the right speaker. With very little effort, it popped right out. The optical disk drive fan was held in place by rubber grommets, requiring no screws to remove. All of the connectors could now be unplugged. The Bluetooth and Wi-Fi antennas are pretty fragile, so take care when dislodging them. Following an iFixit guide, I made sure to note the location of the 4 different types of Torx screws holding the logic board in place. Once I was sure that all of the connectors and screws were removed, I carefully lifted the board out. I'd suggest taping back some of the connectors as they're easily snagged on the logic board. I'm fully aware that it is far safer to blow the dust off the board. However, since it was a blistering 42 degrees and I didn't want to go outside during filming, I chose to suck up the dust instead. I attempted to ground myself to reduce the risk of electrostatic discharge. Considering how dusty iMacs seem to get internally, this one is pretty clean. Getting access to the socketed Core 2 Duo CPU was not that obvious. After a bit of fiddling, I worked out that the small Torx screws on the backplate had to also be removed. It's also worth noting that removing the CPU cooler is voiding the warranty, although since this computer is 10 years old, it probably doesn't matter. Now we can get our first look at the processor. Unsurprisingly, the thermal paste has hardened over the years. To get access to the NVIDIA 9400 graphics processor, I had to remove the Wi-Fi card. Unlike the CPU, the GPU cooler is held in place by 4 small plastic clips. Just like the CPU, however, there is a small temperature sensor you have to unplug. Using a small amount of methylated spirits, I cleaned off the processor dies. Using a Q-tip, I also cleaned up the heat sinks. It's so satisfying dislodging all that paste. With a spotless surface, I applied a small amount of new thermal paste, then clipped the heatsink back on. Fun fact, the CPU is socketed, meaning you can upgrade it or replace it when it dies. Once the cooler is pressed back on, the paste will spread evenly over the die. The rest of the iMac could also do with a dusting. While I could remove the rest of the components, I feel as if this is enough. Opening up one of the fans reveals a deposit of finely compacted dust. Any other dust deposits were cleaned up as well. Piecing the Mac back together was fairly straightforward. Making note of all the screw locations really helped. As far as iMacs go, every component can be replaced, aside from the GPU that is soldered to the logic board. To make the system a lot more responsive without spending a lot of money, I'm going to be putting in a cheap 128GB solid-state drive. The 2.5-inch SATA SSD was mounted on a 3.5-inch metal drive bracket. All the necessary screws were found in the plastic bag. I mounted the hard disk temperature sensor onto the bracket. A total of 4 separate power connectors plugged into the display. It turns out that they can easily be put in the wrong way. I should have labeled them during the disassembly. Here's hoping that they are the right way around. Before I put the case back on, I thought I'd plug it in to see whether it's still turned on. And actually, really surprisingly, it booted right into macOS 10.5, as I actually used that SSD in my PowerMac G5 video. I made sure not to press on the display surface as I reattached the casing. With all the screws in, I made sure the display surface was spotless before I reseated the glass. It's time we gave this iMac a good cleaning. After using a microfiber cloth and some lens cleaner, I got it looking a whole lot better. The rear panel was a little bit tricky to clean. Not only is the surface surprisingly easy to scratch, using methylated spirits began wiping off the port icons. However, using some good old eucalyptus oil got it looking great once again. With it clean and reassembled, I began installing macOS 10.10 Yosemite to the SSD. A short time later, it was ready. There was, however, one big problem. I couldn't for the life of me work out why the sound wasn't working. I went through all of the usual fixes, but looking back at the footage, it turns out I plugged in the speakers into the wrong sockets on the logic board. When I looked back at my footage, I realized this. So once again, I opened up the iMac. Thankfully, I don't need to remove the display panel again. With the connectors finally in the right place, I powered it up, and this time we could hear that lovely boot chime. For the final time, I put the glass back on. For a 10-year-old iMac, what is it actually capable of? Hello guys, and welcome back to another video. First of all, I tried some high-definition YouTube playback. This worked really well, and looked very nice on this display. Running Minecraft with the performance-enhancing mod Optifine installed yielded frame rates between 30 and 40. This is very playable. Lowering the resolution would make it even better. The Unigine Heaven benchmark at the native screen resolution struggled quite a bit. It was reading GPU temperatures of 129 degrees Celsius, which did not seem right. Setting all of the fans to maximum and running the test again resulted in the exact same temperature reading, which didn't fluctuate at all. The Cinebench R15 benchmark scored 5.17 FPS on the GPU test and 149 on the CPU. While we're here, let's make a classy YouTube thumbnail. You'll want to start by adding a colourful outer glow, then brighten the heck out of the image. Lots of very big text will definitely help the viewer know what the video is about. Add a rainbow of obnoxious colour using the gradient tool. Then crank the vibrance and saturation up to 11. We're not done yet, be sure to add even more text. Just in case it wasn't obvious what you're supposed to be looking at, add several big red arrows and a few circles for good measure. iMacs like this are frequently being given away or even thrown out. The port selection is also pretty solid. The design of this machine has held up very well. While it's definitely not as thin as modern tapered edge iMacs, it is definitely far more upgradable. Plus, you do get an optical drive which can be swapped out for a second hard disk. For such an old machine, it is still very usable for basic tasks. However, gaming definitely pushes it a bit beyond its capabilities. I'm very glad to have cleaned this up and made it a very usable desktop once again. Thank you very much for watching. If you've liked this video, feel free to leave a like, and if you want to see more, definitely consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next video.